This is entitled Boundaries in a Therapeutic Boarding School. It is part of staff training at Summit Preparatory School. This is part one of two parts. So what are boundaries? Boundaries separate one thing from another, and this can include physical boundaries, things like fences and walls or property lines, things that actually establish a separation between two things physically, but they can also include social boundaries, and these are the rules or social expectations within various settings. And these provide the social container within which people work and function and have a social life and those sorts of things. And social boundaries can be unrecognized until they're crossed. An example of this has to do with when you go into an elevator. There's sort of a social boundary that everyone faces forward. And if you want to see how powerful that boundary is, try getting in an elevator and facing the wrong direction. And we have boundaries here at Summit Preparatory School. And it really begins with our physical boundaries. And this includes our campus. It includes how our roads are set up. It includes how our buildings are set up. It includes how the architectural structure functions within those buildings. All these provide the physical container for our students. We also have social boundaries at Summit Preparatory School. And our social boundaries are really intended to be therapeutic. They're really intended to, in a way, provide the social container within which our students can really gain the maximum therapeutic advancement. And our therapeutic container, or our therapeutic social boundaries, really focuses on two different components and the importance of maintaining a balance between these two components. And this includes both relationships and structure. We want to have honest, predictable, caring, appropriate adult-child relationships that meet the individual's basic needs. And these relationships do have therapeutic boundaries, which we'll mention in a minute. But we also want to provide appropriate and predictable limits and an engaging structure. And this structure also has boundaries. What are some of the boundaries related to our structure? Certainly program rules, our team expectations, our dorm expectations, our stage advancement expectations, which are really intended to help propel students forward, our academic expectations, our therapeutic assignments, therapeutic activities, our challenge trips, our community service expectations, which even includes a process whereby students propose for a community service project, family retreats, and even our social and recreational activities all have a certain structure to them and certain boundaries. And if you don't understand why the structure's in place, why we do the things we do, it's always a good idea to ask first. You don't just want to ignore that. Because sometimes a certain area of structure has ramifications that you don't really realize. Oh, so I put the other grade in sideways. Who'll notice? Here's an example of someone who did something and didn't follow the rules and just assumed it would be okay without realizing that it did have ramifications. And sometimes this happens with our students. Another boundary related to structure has to do with supervision. This is really important. This is an important component of structure and boundaries here at Summit Preparatory School. And first of all, it really does provide a safety net, and this is important. But our structure, including our use of limits and consequences, especially logical consequences, is meant to do several things. It's meant to help them learn how to self-soothe so that they can really handle strong emotions and learn how to begin to delay gratification. The use of limits and consequences are really intended to help them begin to think before they act, to think logically and sort of weigh their options and look at the possible consequences of their actions before they choose to act. And then as they move on in the program, to begin to act more independently in a more mature manner. And certainly to be willing to accept the consequences of their decision, both positive and negative. And an important component to all of this, to providing that level of structure, those limits and consequences, is to do it with empathy, is to not do it in anger, is to not do it in any way that that ridicules or puts a student down, is to really do it with empathy. I know this is hard for you, but this is something we need to have you do. And expect students to test the boundaries of staff supervision. If you put a limit on them in regards to what they can do, expect them to test it. It really is part of being an adolescent. I just finished telling you the plate was hot. You just had to see for yourself, didn't you? Well, gosh, this is adolescence. And it's important to really look at the boundaries provided around structure in regards to how to make it as therapeutic as possible. If we don't expect enough of our students, they just sort of stay in that comfort zone, that status quo. If we don't really expect them to begin to act more mature. And the result is no change. But if we push them too hard, if we're too rigid in our limits, if we're not willing to empathize with them and really work with them around structure, they can be overwhelmed by the amount of structure, and it can really reinforce defiance or fear or shutting down. This is also the no change zone. So it's a matter of, for us, providing the right amount of structure that actually, pushes them forward and actually expects them to begin to become more and more mature without pushing them so hard that we make them overly defiant or rigid or make them shut down. Next, we will begin to talk about boundaries within therapeutic relationships. This is the other part of that balance of relationships and structure. And for instance, there's boundaries around level of self-disclosure. How much should you share about yourself? Boundaries regarding the use of physical touch. Boundaries regarding accepting gifts from students or parents. Boundaries about having a social relationship. Boundaries about the level of familiarity with students and parents. Certainly boundaries around confidentiality. And just as with structure, the intent of boundaries within therapeutic relationships is really to promote the most therapeutic benefit for our students and parents. And what this means is that if we're too emotionally detached, we cannot form the kind of relationships that students and parents need from us. They need us to be real people. Deprivation therapy for teens just does not work. But there's also something considered a boundary violation where if we treat them as friends, just as another friend, or we're too engaged with them socially or financially or physically, it also does not promote any therapeutic benefit and can actually cause therapeutic harm. Instead, what we want to do is we want to empathize with students and to really connect with them while maintaining important therapeutic boundaries. This provides that growth zone, and that really provides the opportunity and the potential for change. And related to both of these, there is a boundary. There's a boundary between being emotionally detached and having therapeutic empathy, and there's also a boundary that you can cross between therapeutic empathy and a boundary violation. And the boundary between emotional detachment and therapeutic empathy is a boundary crossing where you're choosing to be more real to a student for their benefit. Where a boundary violation is when you go too far. You cross from empathy into a boundary violation. So what is the difference? A boundary crossing means being a real person, but you're doing it in a deliberate manner and in a very professional manner, and you're doing it for the sake of the other person. And you're reinforcing that relationship to provide comfort and understanding, but you're doing it in such a way that the focus is on meeting the needs of the student and the family, and is not done to meet your own personal needs. Where a boundary violation, again, typically this is where you're more of a friend to a student or a family member, which again, you can become a little bit closer to a friend as a student nears the end of the program, but you still need to maintain a certain level of professional boundaries. Certainly a boundary violation is if you use the relationship for any personal gain, money, power, sex, for instance, or to promote a personal agenda. You're proselytizing a certain political or religious belief, for instance. Um, and again, it's also a boundary violation if the main intent of that behavior is really to meet your needs instead of the needs of the student or the family. You also need to be aware that different students and family members can interpret your actions differently than perhaps how you intended. So you need to be careful to avoid even the appearance of misconduct. Suddenly Davis regretted going straight from the barn painting to the lineup. Appearances can sometimes be misread, and so you need to be very, very careful in not appearing to participate in a boundary violation. This is the end of part 1. In part 2, we will talk further about the difference between boundary crossings and boundary violations within therapeutic relationships. Thank you.